Hi everyone, my name is Barbie, and if we haven't met before, I am a branding and communications professional, moving to Scotland in September to pursue a master's in graphic design at the University of Edinburgh. When I was applying to graduate programs and trying to put my portfolio together, one of the things that I struggled to find were resources and guides on how to put together a portfolio specifically for graduate level applications, and more specifically within that realm, how to put together a graduate level portfolio that consisted mostly of professional work and not so much like studio-based work. So in this video, I wanted to walk through the portfolio that I submitted for my application, talk through how I interpreted some of the requirements, and then also walk through a little bit about my portfolio and the thinking behind the processes. Now, this I'm not saying is the perfect blueprint for how a graduate level portfolio should look. I am just trying to be transparent on what I submitted, what worked for me, and then maybe this will be helpful for somebody who might be going through a similar situation.
Okay, so before I actually get into the portfolio itself, I wanted to quickly walk through the actual application requirements because they heavily influenced how I structured both the content and the presentation of my work. So I've put on the screen a screenshot of what the qualifications were when I applied. So you'll see at the kind of middle to bottom portion, that's where I'm going to kind of focus right now. So it says your portfolio should show your creativity, particularly your ideas, focus on the thinking behind your work rather than technique, and also show development as well as finished pieces. So that influenced how I interpreted the bullet points below, which were to display a high standard of conceptual awareness and development, to reflect a clear ability to think laterally. They wanted to clearly see the research methods and routes, and also see the development of the ideas. And they wanted evidence of the working process from, basically inception to resolution. They wanted to see how, we experiment and how we explore. And the last two really are just about original work and, high quality images. So I intentionally structured each project around context, constraints, processes, strategy, and resolution, rather than just simply showcasing, a bunch of visuals on a page. Okay, here's the cover page to my portfolio. This is actually, this was submitted as a PDF. So as we go through, you're gonna see some design choices that might look a little funny as just kind of one-off pages, but I kept the end user in mind. So the application review committee or whatever, I knew that they were going to be viewing this as a continuous PDF. They would be scrolling through it, so I wanted to utilize that opportunity to showcase a little bit more of my creative personal design style. So I took that opportunity and kind of ran with it. So if you stack everything that you'll see on this video, if you stack that in a continuous PDF file, it looks like one long cohesive page, if you will. So that is why there are random lines on the page. So the second page here is my table of contents. So I had 7 pieces here. Really, I had 6 projects, and then I wanted to include a short about me page at the end, even though I knew that they had my personal statement and more stuff about me through the actual application. I just saw that it was best practices to actually include that in your portfolio. They didn't specifically ask for it, but I threw that in there. And if you were viewing this as a PDF, you could actually scroll over, each section here, each number, each project, if you will. And if you click on it, it will actually jump to the head page for that project. So the first project in my portfolio is Dynamic, which ended up being a brand identity and digital system project. Dynamic is a whole building performance brand that's focused on improving a building's impact on the business itself. So the core idea behind the brand is really helping organizations take control of one of their largest assets, which is their building, and make it work more strategically for their bottom line through modernization, efficiency, analytics, controls, and other building performance solutions. One thing I saw consistently while researching graduate portfolio best practices was the importance of clearly defining collaboration and your role within the projects. So, especially when the work exists in a professional environment and involves multiple stakeholders. So, for each project, I tried to clearly establish who I collaborated with, what my responsibilities were, and what deliverables were involved, and also the overall timeline of the work. So the core challenge behind this project was that the organization was delivering measurable business impact, but the brand itself was still being perceived primarily as a technical HVAC provider by our target audience. So sales conversations were often getting redirected to facilities teams instead of executive decision makers, which created a disconnect between the value being delivered and the way the organization was being understood. So a large part of my approach focused on internal discovery and identifying where communication was breaking down across audiences. So the key insight that came out of that process was that the people responsible for building outcomes were not necessarily the same people responsible for business outcomes, and the brand needed to be able to speak fluently to both. So that realization ultimately informed the strategic direction of the entire project. The next phase focused on defining the brand personality and communication style. So we explored several archetype directions before ultimately landing on the pioneer archetype because it balanced innovation and forward-thinking leadership without feeling reckless or overly disruptive. So that framework then helped guide the voice, the tone, and overall positioning of the brand moving forward. So from there, I move into some of the experimentation and development work behind the identity system itself. This included competitor analysis, naming exploration, and evaluating how other organizations in the space positioned themselves visually and verbally. So the final name that we decided on, Dynamic, was selected because it combined ideas of movement, adaptability, intelligence, and measurable progress, which aligned closely with the overall strategic direction that we had established. Once the verbal identity was established, the project moved into building the visual system. The identity was designed to feel modern, strategic, and forward-moving while still maintaining credibility within a traditionally conservative industry. The later sections of the project show how the identity system was extended across multiple touchpoints, including digital experiences, executive messaging, sales collateral, print applications, and social media systems. Now, one thing that was especially important to me throughout this project was making sure that the brand functioned as a scalable communication system rather than simply a logo or a visual style. Overall, this project really shaped how I think about branding as a process of clarification and translation, especially within a complex organization where different audiences interpret value very differently. So it also reinforced my interest in systems thinking and communication structure, which really became a recurring theme throughout the rest of the portfolio. The next project is Dynamic Go, which is an internal mobile application designed to help capture customer insights and operational observations in real time. The purpose of this app was to create a more consistent system for sharing relationship context and site-level observations across teams in order to improve workflow and customer experience. The core challenge behind this project was that valuable customer insights were already being identified during day-to-day operations, but there really wasn't a structured or accessible system for capturing and activating that information at scale. So as a result, a lot of useful operational and relationship knowledge remained informal and disconnected across the teams. A large part of my approach focused on collaborative discovery and system definition. So I worked with leadership and engineering to identify how information needed to be structured and how users would realistically interact with the app in the field, and also how we could reduce the friction during input. So one thing I found especially interesting about this project was that many of the design decisions really prioritized clarity, speed, and usability over, visual expression. Overall, this project reinforced my interest in systems thinking and user-centered design, really particularly in environments where clarity and adoption are more important than visual complexity. It also challenged me to think about design less as isolated screens and really more as a structured experience embedded within real operational behavior. The next project is Total Comfort Solutions, which is a legacy commercial HVAC brand with over 50 years of established recognition and a very strong internal people-first culture. So unlike the dynamic project, this was not a full repositioning effort or complete reinvention. The challenge here was much more focused on refinement, clarification, and scalability within an already well-established brand system. One of the most important constraints within this project was preserving long-standing trust and recognition while still modernizing the overall system. So through internal discovery and system auditing, I identified several communication and structural gaps across the brand. Client-facing materials lacked a cohesive narrative structure, the digital experience relied heavily on the logo for recognition, and many of the company's cultural values existed primarily as text-heavy documentation rather than accessible, visible systems. So existing brand colors were retained to preserve some of this recognition, but additional supporting elements and visual systems were introduced to add some flexibility, warmth, and stronger hierarchy across all these applications. Actually, one of the most interesting extensions of this project was the development of the TCS Cares program as an internal employee experience sub-brand. Originally, TCS Cares primarily existed as an outward-facing community outreach initiative. I repositioned the TCS Cares as a structured sub-brand within the larger ecosystem in order to make employee care more visible, accessible, and scalable across the organization. The second sub-brand extension was TCS Academy, which focused on technician training and professional development. At the time, development programs already existed internally, but they lacked a unified identity, consistent language, as well as visual progression pathways. So since the organization is primarily composed of field technicians, this system really needed to feel practical. We wanted it to feel credible, and it also needed to be hands-on rather than overly corporate or academic. But overall, this project really reinforced my interest in design as a process of clarification under constraint. So rather than building something entirely new, this work focused on strengthening structure, improving consistency, and translating organizational values into really scalable systems that could actually function across both external communication as well as internal culture over time. The next project is Big Charlotte, which is the Charlotte chapter of the National Building Intelligence Group organization. This project was focused less on building a brand from scratch and really more on helping a local chapter establish a stronger sense of identity, visibility, and community presence within a much larger national structure. So one of the first things I noticed while reviewing the existing experience was that the Charlotte chapter itself didn't really feel distinct. The events were organized and functional, but really visually everything still felt very tied to the national organization. There wasn't much that reflected the personality, the energy, or really even the local community surrounding the chapter itself. The chapter already had an existing logo, and a lot of their digital presence lived inside the national organization's web structure. So the challenge wasn't really creating a completely separate identity, it was figuring out how to create a stronger local visibility and engagement while still staying aligned with the larger organization. A lot of my approach here came from direct observation and participation. I attended events, talked with the chapter leadership, and spent time understanding how people were actually interacting with this organization in person. What became really clear to me was that the sense of community already existed, it just wasn't being reflected consistently through the digital experience or the visual communication. So rather than reinventing the identity, I wanted to focus on building a clearer system around what already existed. So typography, color usage, hierarchy, and the digital structure were all organized in a way that made the chapter feel more recognizable, energetic, and cohesive without losing alignment with the national organization. One of the biggest deliverables of this project was actually the website structure itself. The chapter president wanted a dedicated digital presence, so a lot of the work involved determining what information people actually needed, how they would actually navigate the site, and how the chapter could create clearer pathways for participation, sponsorship, and engagement. This project also extended into physical event materials and community touchpoints. Since Big Charlotte is such an in-person relationship-driven organization, I wanted the visual language to feel visible during events and not just online. Overall, this project really reinforced my interest in designing for participation as well as community experience. So a lot of this work wasn't really about creating something visually loud or anything, visually disruptive. It was more about helping an existing community feel more visible and feel more connected and feel more cohesive across both their digital and their physical spaces. This next project shifts away from organizational systems and into a much smaller, more material-focused identity study. The shop at Sweet Retreat is a woodworking practice where the identity needed to function not as a printed logo, but as a physical brand that burned directly into wood using a heated iron. So what interested me most about this project was how quickly material constraints started influencing my design decisions. So early versions of this mark used much finer line work, but once testing began, those details started breaking down when actually transferred through the heat into the wood surfaces. What I really liked about this project was that it forced me to think less about how a design looked on screen and more about how it actually behaved out in the real world. So this final identity is intentionally simple and intentionally restrained because its success depends on consistency, clarity, as well as physical performance rather than visual complexity. The final project in my portfolio is a boutique textile study, which explored processes, sequencing, and material constraint in a very different way from the earlier branding and systems work. So what interested me most about this process was that every decision had to be made in advance. Since each wax and dye layer remained visible in the final piece, there wasn't really an opportunity to revise or remove previous choices later on. So the work really became much more about planning, sequencing, and really understanding how each step was going to affect the next step. I included this project because it reflects something that connects a lot of my portfolio together, which is my interest in structure and interdependent systems, as well as process-driven decision-making. Even though this medium is completely different, I think the underlying approach is actually very similar to how I think through branding and communication systems, where each decision really shapes the conditions for everything that follows. All right, well, that is the general overview of the portfolio that I submitted as part of my application to the University of Edinburgh's Graphic Design Master's Program. One of the things I really found most interesting while putting this portfolio together was realizing how much of my work consistently comes back to systems, structure, communication, and clarity. I mean, even across projects that look totally different on the surface. Whether I was working on branding systems, internal tools, community experience, or material studies, I kept finding myself drawn to the relationship between processes, decision-making, and as well as how design shapes really understanding over time. So putting this portfolio together honestly gave me a much clearer understanding of really my own design practice and the kinds of problems that I'm most interested in exploring further as I move into this graduate study. And if you're currently applying to design programs yourself, hopefully seeing somebody else's process, especially from a more professionally rooted background, was helpful in some way. If you have any questions about any portion of this process or portfolio, please feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will either make another video trying to answer the questions or I will answer them in the comments. But yeah, thanks for watching.